Hey everybody, welcome to the Peep Show. Today we are talking about the very strange ending to the USS Inaugural. On the last episode, we talked about the USS Ares, which is a hydrofoil ship that's located in Missouri. Well, I mentioned in there that there's another ship that was located in Missouri, and that's the USS Inaugural, which is a World War II minesweeper. And it has a very strange tale. It moves from the heroic efforts that it had during World War II, functioning as a minesweeper, and after World War II. And then it also then eventually went to the reserve fleet, eventually was turned into a tourist attraction, and then it met a very sad ending with lots of complications, which include many of vices that exist in this world. There's some gambling in there. There's someone breaking in and taking something. There is a murder associated tangentially with the USS Inaugural, and there's still an ongoing mystery. So buckle your seatbelts, and I'm going to do my best to cover as much ground as I can. And please forgive my my Army interpretations of Navy things. I did work in a joint assignment for many years, so I actually did work around the Navy. But I'm not 100% familiar with ships. And also, I'm probably going to mispronounce a few names in here. So, you know what? Deal with it. So, behind me is the USS Inaugural AM-242. So let's go ahead and get started with this crazy story. So this is the Wikipedia page of the USS Inaugural. And here it is during its time in service, painted in a dazzle paint scheme. And here it is during its time as a tourist attraction in St. Louis, which was from 1968 until 1993, when it met its fate. And this is what it basically looks like today when it comes up from the Mississippi River. So let's just talk about what the USS Inaugural was. It was built by the Winslow Marine Railway and Shipbuilding Company, laid down on the 22nd of May 1944, launched on the 1st of October 44, commissioned 30 December 44, decommissioned on the 9th of September 46, put into the reserve fleet in 1955, stricken from the list in 1967, became a floating museum in 1968, right by the St. Louis Arch, and then it sank during the Great Flood of 1993. So let's just talk about its actual wartime service, which is the positive part of this story. It was commanded by Lieutenant John Pace, who was in the Navy Reserve, did a shakedown cruise off the California coast, and sailed to Pearl Harbor on the 14th of March 1945, and then performed escort duties between Hawaii and islands of the Western Pacific. She was at Saipan in May, and then worked with a convoy bound for Okinawa, which was the largest amphibious campaign in World War II. And then had several attacks on suspected submarines. And during the Battle for Okinawa, patrolled the seas around the island group, often firing at Japanese aircraft as they did kamikaze attacks. Although it did go out to sea on the 19th through the 24th when a large typhoon blew through the area. When the war was over, then she went in the waters around Japan, Korea, and did minesweeping, cleaning up all these sea mines so that those areas could return to civilian use. So we'll talk a little bit more about those in a few minutes. So she swept approaches to Jensen, Korea, and later cleared mines off the coast of Nagasaki and uh, every Navy guy can say this one, Sasebo, Japan. Then went back to Okinawa, returned to minesweeping duty, and eventually sailed for the United States on Christmas Eve of 1945. Via Saipan, Pearl Harbor, arrived San Pedro, California in early February of 46, sailed out again in March for Galveston, which is basically where she stayed up until the early 60s. Again, she was put into the Ready Reserve Fleet, also known as the Rusty Reserve Fleet, where those ships are just maintained, and there's a crew that goes through and looks at the ships and tries to keep them in various states of readiness. And I've actually been on some of the ships in Suisun Bay. I took a trip out there with the military, and we actually got to go on board several of them. And they have all sorts of different processes that they do for protecting them from rust and mildew and things like that. But she was struck from the Navy list on the 1st of March 1967 and then sold. So she, in her history, she cleared 82 mines. Now the ship itself was 530 tons. It was an Admirable class minesweeper. There is one other Admirable class minesweeper that still exists, and that's up in a park on dry land in Omaha. Although recently they, within the last couple of years, it flooded, and that ship actually floated again, and they've got it, I think, righted again, because when it went back down, it didn't go even. So it was 184 feet 6 inches. The beam was 33 feet. Draft was just under 10 feet and could go 15 knots. Had 104 crew members and 3-inch 50 caliber or 1 3-inch by 50 caliber gun. If you're not familiar, the general definition would be 3-inch, and 50 caliber talks about the length of the barrel, I believe. And then in terms of Navy, it's not 50 cal as in like an Army Browning machine gun. It's a different definition. And then there were 6 Ehrlichon 20 millimeter cannons, 4 40 millimeter Bofors guns, 2 depth charge projectors, and then 2 depth charge tracks. So this was a minesweeper. And if you aren't familiar with sea mines, let me refer you to the most basic course on sea mines that certainly I studied as a child, and that would be the Mine Hero episode of Gilligan's Island, and that's where I learned all about sea mines. So the plot here is that they're trying to find metal to make a raft to get off of Gilligan's Island. So meanwhile, while trying to make this raft, they Gilligan actually lassos this magnetic sea mine, and obviously you can see it's magnetic because it's taking his necklace, and Mr. Howell's very upset about that. And fortunately, they were able to take some pressed fiber and create that civil defense hat that Mr. Howell's wearing. So, they can create those things, but they just can't create a boat or repair the one that they came on. And again, it's magnetic. It's pulling them that direction. Ooh, there's Ginger. Ooh, a little scarlet fever going on here. Oh, well, even Lovey's got a pith helmet also. So eventually their solution is they decide that they're going to tow it out to sea, and Gilligan feels bad because it's his fault. So eventually he gets on a raft and he tows it out there. At some point he actually sets off the timer on it, and he actually gets it out there before it blows up. So again, here he is taking it out. So like I say, if you've never seen that episode, I highly recommend it. It kind of gives you some very, very basic, it's a very basic training film on sea mines. In all seriousness, sea mines are a huge problem if you're in the Navy, and they are a very, very cheap way to disrupt naval operations. Now, generally, they're located closer to the shore. Many of them are moored to the bottom, although some are they're put out there for floating. And really, it's either for denial of a area. If you know sea mines are in there, and they can break a ship in half. Or you can force minesweeping operations in that area, which forces your enemy to use assets and maybe delay them from what they're trying to do. Or you can just put them out there and let them discover it, and then damage a ship, and then that would then force scenario 1 or 2, where they have to, they're denied access to that area, or they have to sweep the mines. So the purpose of the USS Inaugural was to sweep mines. And World War II mines of that era, there are really 3 types. There's the standard contact mine, there's the magnetic mine, and then there was acoustic and a pressure sensitive one. And understand that these things were packed with explosives, and what it could do is it can lift a ship up actually out of the water and cause it to crack the hull, or maybe the wave of the explosive in the water can then also cause damage to the ship and maybe crush some of it, create leaks, things like that. Or maybe the explosive will actually damage the ship. So they're a relatively cheap way to deny access to an area if you're the defender. So the U.S. Navy invested very heavily into minesweepers and built many of them. And this is the basic way that they would clear mines. Now, sometimes, if you can see, these here would be some of the moored sea mines. So one thing that it can do is one method is they could put a cable between 2 minesweepers, and then sometimes minesweepers were wooden hulled in case they were magnetic mines. In the case of the Inaugural, it was not. So they would put a cable between 2 minesweepers. They would run down a lane and then drag the cable behind them, and then it would cut the mooring line for the mine. It would pop up, and then they might shoot it with something to get it to explode. Or they had, this was a more advanced technique, what I'm showing you here, where they would have a float. And then basically this is kind of the same thing I just described, except this would allow a single minesweeper to sweep without another ship. So those mines would pop up to the surface, and then they could deal with them. Also, the minesweeper had an anti-submarine capability. Generally, those ships did both. So this is how it operated during the war. So the ship becomes a floating museum. So now I'm going to refer to the Riverfront Times article. And there's a lot going on here, and I'm going to do my best to kind of boil it down and distill some of the more inflammatory things that are in here. So this article is from 2007. The Riverfront Times is kind of an alternative paper for the city of St. Louis. It tends to have a lot of different events going on there, and a little bit more edgy journalism than the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Okay, the strange tale of USS Inaugural. The old warship meets its formidable enemy, the Mississippi River. This is by a Chad Garrison, and it was published on the 7th of March, 2007. And there's a follow-up, which I will cover also. There's a lot going on here. So in this story, it talks about how basically tells the same story that I told you before about the history of the ship. But the Inaugural was in the Atlantic Reserve Fleet and mothballed there for the next 20 years until a guy by the name of Robert O'Brien, who was a young St. Louis entrepreneur, I think he was in his 30s at this point, spied it in a Navy surplus catalog. Sorry, I don't get those. I wish I did, though. So he thought this would be a good idea to bring to St. Louis as a tourist attraction. And this was, around the time the St. Louis Arch had gone up or was going up. I forget exactly when it was built, but so he wanted to put it down there as a tribute. People could come see it, but the engines no longer worked in the ship. So, but the vessel was in pretty good shape. In this case, it was really only like 20 some years old and had only been used for less than 2 years. Really less than one actual year, about 1 year of actual service, maybe 14 months. So, O'Brien says, it was virtually untouched inside. The ship logs were still inside. All the spare parts were still there. And it cost him about $250,000 to purchase, paint, and lug the ship up the Mississippi River. I'm not sure whether it had ever been dry docked. I think that's part of the story that's not really covered in these articles, is that especially ships that are in salt water need to be dry docked. Roughly, in this case, it probably needs to be dry docked maybe every 20 years. If not, you might be able to go longer if you're doing things to preserve it. And there are ways to preserve ships like this in the water. There are different, I believe there's zinc plates that you can put on, which draws the corrosion towards the zinc. And then also there's an electric system that you can put on it that charges the hull and helps reduce rust as well. Although the Inaugural would be in fresh water for the rest of its career, but still it had been sitting in some at least partially salty water for most of its early life. So, as it says here, more than a few onlookers considered the ocean-going gunboat to be out of place in St. Louis, but O'Brien figured that plenty of Midwest landlubbers would pay $1 to tour a genuine Navy warship. My own history with this ship, I don't think I ever went on it. Maybe I did as a child. I don't really remember that. But I do remember my first joint assignment, which would be the J2 of U.S. Transcom and the Joint Transportation Reserve Unit. I was a plank holder, and we were the first joint reserve unit in the history of Department of Defense. That sometimes the Navy folks, if they wanted to do a promotion ceremony or a retirement ceremony, would go down to the Inaugural and do it actually on the Navy ship, which I thought was kind of cool. And so this would have been, 91, 92 into the summer of 93 before things got kind of bad for the ship. So over the next 10 years, thousands of vacationers, school children, military buffs climbed the Inaugural's gangplanks, explored its cabins, and I'd make believe kamikaze through its gun sights. Although by the late 70s, O'Brien had had enough. Maintenance costs were skyrocketing. Imagine that. Maintaining a Navy ship is going to be expensive. The only thing more expensive than a Navy ship would be a airplane, military airplane. Keeping the boat anchored against the ever-fluctuating river had proved a greater headache than he'd anticipated. And there were several large floods that did occur during this time. I lived upriver, probably about 100 miles from St. Louis, by way of the river, and there were several very, very large floods, through the time that I was growing up during the 1970s and the 1980s. Although the big one was in 93. So Brian decided to wash his hands of this, and he found a buyer in a show business promoter by the name of Frank Pearson, who owned a theater and a showboat, which is a paddle-wheeled excursion boat that played host to musicals and dinnertime dramas. In fact, one New Year's Eve, I'm thinking maybe in the mid-90s, I actually spent it on board of some sort of a big paddle-wheel party boat out in the Mississippi River. And we loaded roughly about the same place where the Inaugural was located. Okay, the Inaugural seems to not have been much of a business boon for Pearson, who died in 1988. According to the newspaper accounts, when he died, he was in quite a bit of debt. But the one thing that was not in Pearson's estate was the USS Inaugural. According to the St. Louis Port Authority, a guy by the name of Floyd Warman had taken over the mooring lease for the Inaugural in 1984. And he's a politically connected businessman who's known throughout St. Louis. And he had a different vision for the USS Inaugural. So he decided to turn it into the spirit of the river. So he took the USS Inaugural, he added a floating Burger King restaurant that looked like a steamboat, and then he lashed a heliport barge, which you could then take flight tours around St. Louis in. And then he added another barge, which had a Taco Bell in it. So the USS Inaugural went from dodging kamikazes to being next door to a Burger King and a Taco Bell. Although the helicopter thing actually sounds kind of fun. And there are still some helipads down in that area today if you look on Google Maps. And I'll show you that when we go there. In fact, I could do that right now. Let's see, here's Google Map. Yeah, so this is the St. Louis Arch. And this is Google Earth 3D, and this is the area where it actually was located, was down in here. And let's just kind of spin this around a little bit, zoom in a little bit. You can kind of see the helipad area right there. So this would orient it a little better. So it was down in this area, the Gateway Arch being right there. Let's go back to our Riverfront Times article. Okay. So we've got the Inaugural, we got the Burger King, we got the Taco Bell, we got the heliport. They're all sitting there. Now, Warman soon ran into some financial trouble. A lot of his money came from this oil business that his father had started, and that oil business filed for bankruptcy. And one of the banks was suing to collect him on $1.7 million on a defaulted debt, according to this article. So, in need of cash, Warman saw his $3,000 riverfront lease to the city as a possible way that he could pay off these debts. And this was about the time that riverboat gambling was becoming something of a thing here in Missouri. Now, originally it started off that it actually had to be a true riverboat, an actual floating vessel in the river. And it's so funny how it's actually changed over the years. And there may be a little bit of hyperbole in this, but it started off as an actual boat, then it became a boat just on river water, then it became it has to be connected to the river, and then it became like it has to kind of look like a boat. And then like nowadays it seems like the casino gaming thing, the riverboat gambling, like this is just my interpretation of it. Like you just have to have like boat in the title. There's a casino in Boonville, Missouri, which is not too far from here, and it's on the river. That's about it. I don't think any part of it floats. Okay. So Warman has this $3,000 riverfront lease with the city. So riverboats companies, gaming companies wanted to come in and take advantage of that. This was an opportunity. He already had the lease. He just had to transfer it. So he knew a casino company would pay a lot of money for that. But one of his friends, who was on the who was a state rep running for mayor of St. Louis, was advocating for the change to casino gaming, but it turned out that actually he had shares in Warman's concession company, which would include the Inaugural and the Burger King and all that kind of stuff, and his other businesses. So he showed he had some personal stake to gain in this. This state rep ended up losing the election for the mayor, possibly because of this scandal, but they allowed the city ended up allowing it a change to casino uh, gambling, put a gambling chip in there. So in June of 1993, the board approved the measure changing the mooring lease to allow for a gaming boat. And the deal would give the city $16 million for Argosy Gaming Company for the rights to set up a casino. And then the guy who had the lease and had the spirit of the river, which would include the Inaugural and the Burger King and the Taco Bell and the heliport, would get 33.5 million in Argosy stock for selling his lease. Now understand, this is in June of 1995, so the Inaugural is really just a couple months away from its demise. Neither the city or Warman ever saw the bulk of his riches. The lease agreement still required approval from the mayor, who was the opponent of the guy who was advocating for it. Mayor Bosley reiterated on several occasions his disapproval of adding more gaming boats to the downtown riverfront. Although, while this is all going on, there's another problem going on. That's the flood of 1993. The flood of 1993 was a huge problem here in the Midwest. And, I grew up in Quincy, Illinois, which is a river city. And I can name 3 different areas during the summer of 1993 that I drove through that flooded. Literally within a day, and it was underwater. One time I drove through West Quincy, Illinois, and I was flying to San Francisco with my reserve unit, and I woke up in my hotel room in I believe it was called the Jukebox Hotel. Can't remember anything else about it, but I remember I flipped on CNN. I'm like, that looks really familiar. Their head story, and it was actually West Quincy, where I had just gone through, was flooded and now in flames. My mom worked for a trucking company at that point, and they had a driver who was over in West Quincy dropping off a trailer. And the story is that a man who had a reputation for being a serial arsonist in Quincy, he burned several buildings, and in fact, my stepdad suspected that he actually burned some hay bales that same summer on his land. He was accused of being on the levee when the levee broke, and he damaged the levee to the point that it then broke. So what happens is that then the TV crew goes and interviews him, and of course the police chief and sheriff are watching this on TV as they're coordinating the emergency response to get people out of West Quincy. And they're like, isn't that guy who burned those churches? So I know he ended up being arrested, and his trial actually ended up in the town in Missouri that I later lived in, although I didn't really have any connection to that trial. But he was convicted of causing a catastrophe, and he's in prison right now. So although he still claims innocence, so it's kind of funny how those things all kind of tie together. But so flood of 93 was bad. Oh, the second place that flooded, I was driving to South St. Louis County to visit someone I was dating. I drove through the Chesterfield Flats, which if you're on Highway 6440 and you go across the Missouri River Bridge, there's a whole bunch of stores and businesses and auto dealerships and malls and things like that. And the Chesterfield Bottoms. Well, at this time, there was nothing there. It was completely undeveloped. So I drove through that, across the bridge, drove through there. And by the time I had gotten to South County, which is probably 30 minutes later, that entire area was underwater. And then that was on Friday, and then on Saturday I went to an event over. It was like at an American Legion VFW hall, like a wedding reception or party or something like that, and came back, and that area had actually flooded the next day, and I had nothing to do with it. Swear to God. So it was a really, really big deal. There was a cemetery somewhere around here in central Missouri where the river had gouged it completely out and pushed all these caskets all over the place. So then these retired funeral directors got to deal with the collection of caskets and figure out who was who when they reburied him. It was a big mess. So flood of 93, bad stuff is going on. And the water is rising, rising, rising. And by late June, runoff from the converged rivers between the Missouri and the Mississippi River, they join north of St. Louis. So water was running into the Missouri River and also the Mississippi River from way upstream and even from this area. So the steps, the water was halfway up the arch steps, and it crested at 49.58 feet. At 10:45 on the 1st of August, 1993, a park ranger responding to the sound of an explosion on the Spirit of the River arrived in time to witness the entire complex, the Inaugural, the Burger King, the Taco Bell, and the heliport just float off into the darkness. So they had broken free. Free at last. Shortly after that, the flotilla slammed into the Poplar Street Bridge. Let's go to the map here. Okay, so this is where it was at. This is the Poplar Street Bridge. If you've ever gone over I-55 coming from the south, heading towards Chicago, this is probably the bridge you used. If you've gone on I-70, this used to be the bridge that you would use, although I think they've rerouted. And you take Highway 4064, this is the one that you go over. And I go over this, I've gone over this bridge hundreds of times. So funny story about this bridge. I was drilling with a Marine reservist who was at US Transcom, and a lot of times we would travel together because we both lived out of town. One time he was driving back over this bridge to head back to the Missouri town that we lived in, and somehow there was a box in the road. So he was driving his car, pushing this, and this box got in front of him, and he's pushing this box with his station wagon car that he had. I forget what he had, maybe an escort wagon or something. And he's pushing this box all the way across the bridge, and it's in front of his car, and there's really no place to get off. So eventually what he did is he stopped and got out of his car on this bridge, which is crazy, and got the box out of the way. So I digress. So the Spirit of the River comes down and crashes into this bridge, falls apart, and then continues down as separate pieces on its own. So what happens? It hits the bridge. The force of the collision rips away the upper decks of the Burger King restaurant and left the Inaugural steel superstructure dented and scarred. Or left the bridge's steel superstructure dented and scarred. Separated by the impact, the components of the Spirit of the River spun downriver. The Coast Guard made a breakaway call that they've got a ship. They've got some vessels heading downstream under no control, and they wanted all able-bodied vessels to try and help. The heliport smacked into the Illinois shore. The Taco Bell just sank and disappeared. And then 4 miles downstream, the Burger King got caught. And then eventually by 1:20 a.m., they got control of the Inaugural. So this thing was on its own for about 2.5 hours. So the tugboat Mary Burke guided the World War II relic to a spot along the Missouri side of the river, just south of the Choteau Avenue, or south of Choteau Avenue. So the Inaugural lost its mast, suffered a 6-inch gash above the waterline, reported no other damage to the steel-hulled vessel. And one of the things that could have happened is there's a bunch of fueling stations south of St. Louis for different vessels, and this thing could have ran into one of those and caused a massive explosion. but it didn't happen. So the Inaugural survives this and makes it into the 2nd of September, or 2nd of August. But then it sits there, and on September the 23rd, an employee at a nearby river dredging company arrives at work and reports seeing the ship leaning on one side. By 2 p.m., it was basically sank. It was on the bottom of the Mississippi River on the shore with only its bow rising above the waterline. I have a simple question here about this whole story. Why didn't they repair the gash? A 6-inch gash. I could have taken my flux core welder, a piece of plate steel, gone out there and fixed it, but they didn't do it. Now, remember what I said about dry docking? It's very likely that this ship had never been dry docked, so there were probably some weak spots in the hull. So maybe there was some other damage that occurred on the vessel. Maybe there's some weak spots, whatever. So anyway, the Inaugural sank, and that's where it is today. But wait, there's more. So then there were all sorts of questions about wrongdoing about the vessel, and that whole incentive of the multi-million-dollar gaming contract quickly came to some people's minds. And I'm not going to get too far into that. If you want to know more about that, read the Riverfront Times article. I'm not sure what to make of all of this, but the Coast Guard report basically said that it became untethered and went downstream, which is a big duh. Yeah, that happens. Why do planes crash? They hit the ground. Same story. But there were 3 anchor cables. 2 of them were actually downstream, so they didn't really do much, especially in this heavy tide that they had, this heavy current that they had with the flood of '93. But the 3rd anchor cable did not break, but it ran out of line because someone failed to padlock the iron hooks that held the chain in place. So the 3rd anchor, the loss of the 3rd anchor cable is what the Coast Guard believed caused the breakaway. The guy speculated that the hook was intentionally opened to release the chain. And from the report, it says the owner of the Spirit of America failed to ensure the moorings were properly maintained for the prevailing river conditions. If the owner had properly maintained the complex moorings, the breakaway may not have occurred. Although there's another theory out there that's kind of interesting, and apparently there were some the time of the breakaway, the ship had some flames were seen on board the ship, or of the complex, I guess is a better way to describe it. And one of the things that happens and comes out of this is there's a statement from an off-duty sheriff's deputy, backed by some other witnesses, who reported seeing 2 men paddling a skiff from the Burger King vessel moments before the breakaway. According to the deputy, the men landed on the shore, then kicked their dinghy back in the water, the river's current, and disappeared, and appeared very distressed. When questioned by park rangers, the men identified themselves as employee of Gateway Riverboat Cruises, President Casino's subsidiary, which is the competition of what would become, or what was, Argosy Gaming. And the men said, according to the deputy's account, they were just doing their job and they were told to disconnect the Taco Bell. Again, I don't understand that, but the Taco Bell did sink pretty quick, so I don't know what to make of that. Okay. So then there's just more speculation about what's going on. So what happens then from there is there's a salvage company that comes into the picture. And again, this article goes through quite a bit of it. But they go and they try and do a salvage to refloat the Inaugural, but one of the problems is where it has settled is near, the way I interpret this is near some sewage pipes. And the whole thing it says it's filled full of silt, although the way it describes it, it's not exactly silt. It's probably something else. In fact, it said that they had to cut a hole in the side of the ship to rig a cable. A spark from one of our saws caught sewer gas on fire. They actually had to cut a hole to get some of the gas that had developed, the methane that had developed inside the ship out of it. So then the guy that's doing the salvage job in this article says that he tried to put a wire around the boat to pick it up, and the cables cut right through the hull. Remember what I said about dry docking? So it sounds like it was already kind of weak to begin with. So at that point, Moore realized the ship was beyond repair, and his bill for working on the wreck had climbed to the tens of thousands of dollars, and the guy who owned it wasn't paying. So as part, and this is where the story gets complicated again, as part collateral and part souvenir, Moore says he ripped the anti-aircraft gun from the bow of the Inaugural and placed the rusty weapon in the front of his salvage barge. For months, the gun remained on deck, earning Moore a reputation as something of a freshwater pirate. Eventually, he took off the gun and set it on his barge, and then set it inside the old East Wind's tug on Chateau Island. It was around then that another guy got in touch with him and said he wanted to donate the guns to some museum. And the salvage guy says, well, I was owed some money and I was hoping to kind of keep the gun as collateral. So the two agreed on a deal. The gun would end up getting donated by the salvage operator to a not-for-profit ran by the other guy, who would then give him a tax statement for $10,000, and that could help solve that problem. So there was an arrangement to move the Bofors gun on the National Guard flatbed truck from the island to his friend's warehouse in South St. Louis City. So there's a bunch of other stuff going on here. So what ends up happening is a gentleman who I knew by the name of Carol Venable. If you're an MVPA person, you would probably, an old school MVPA person, you'll probably know who he is. I knew him from World War II reenacting throughout the 80s into the early 90s. And if you're not familiar, he was really quite the character. And he had a very large military vehicle collection. He bought a lot of stuff in the 50s and 60s. And his stuff, he had a lot of vehicles, to include a Willys MA, scout car. I think there was an M20 that was part of that. Jeeps, things like that, half tracks. But his stuff was always not very well restored, but he was more focused on having more things than good things. And generally his stuff operated okay. So anyway, he was a bit of a character. Again, he was wheelchair bound. He was a polio survivor. And his nickname was Captain, and I believe that was maybe a honorary Civil Air Patrol rank is the story that I always heard. So, and he started this Armed Forces Museum, which is a place basically to store all these things. And there's some other people who were parts of that, and I knew other people who had stuff there. And the Armed Forces Museum was actually located for a while at the Granite City Soldier Support Center, which is right across the river from St. Louis. And it was where my reserve unit was located from 96 to 99. So when I was Battalion S1, I was a captain at the time. If I knew those guys were down there working, I would swing by and say hi to Venable and, see what they're working on. And I'd be like, hey, Captain. We kind of have that kind of relationship with each other. And I didn't know him really well, but and I also organized a World War II reenactment up in Kirksville, Missouri, which is where I was living. And he actually loaned me an M3 Scout car and a Jeep, and we got an Army transportation to haul it up there and haul it back. And scared the crap out of me one time because I was driving the M3 Scout car on Highway 63, and the whole front end shuddered when I was going about 40 miles an hour, and it scared the hell out of me. So anyway, now this article, it says that the museum guy, the guy who had taken possession of the gun, had made a deal with the devil, and the devil would be Captain Venable, Carol Venable, and I think that's a bit strong. My experience with Carol was that he's a very cantankerous, opinionated person, unlike everyone else in the military vehicle hobby. But also, yeah, I think his heart was in the right place. Maybe his execution wasn't. And I think he was very focused on having a big collection and trying to maintain it. So the deal was that the Venable group, the Armed Forces Museum, would take possession of the gun and maybe try and restore it some, meanwhile, while they tried to find another home for it. In 1997, there was an issue with Venable regarding acquisition of an M3 tank. According to the Post-Dispatch. And at that time, there were a lot of different park relics, things that were like at American Legion Post, things like that, that had been given from the military, and no one had kept track of them for a long time. So some of those things would end up in people's collections. And personally, I would not touch any of that stuff with a 10-foot pole, just like an illegal firearm, or boat anchor. I would never touch any of that stuff just because it's not worth the trouble. But during that time, no one checked on them. But it seemed like no one cared. And then all of a sudden, the military started caring about that stuff and started doing inventories and figuring out where stuff went. So his question about an M3 tank. So the deal was that Venable would then would receive the gun, which is not a small item. I mean, this is a Bofors mount, probably weighs several thousand pounds. So the Armed Forces Museum would go ahead and restore it, while they then found a place for it to be put. So the deal was brokered, and he gave Venable the directions to go get it. But a few days later, the owner of the warehouse called up and was pissed and said someone smashed through the gate and took off with the gun. And they called Venable knew nothing about it. And then the guy who was trying to donate to the museum claims to know nothing about it. So, meanwhile, another guy gains the salvage title of the USS Inaugural, which has been sitting in the river for 5 years at this point. From the previous owner. Fortunately, the guy that owned it before is kind of like, okay, get this thing off my books. And so the guy who took possession of it was going to scrap it, but he wanted to save the bow to maybe put into a museum. But it's not that simple. And let me just show you where the Inaugural ended up. So again, we were here, and it crashed into this bridge and then ended up downstream. And this is where they eventually took it back to. So this is where it sits right now. So this is the Missouri side. And when the water gets low, you can actually see quite a bit of it. So it's maybe 20 yards offshore, when the water's high, and you can maybe get your feet wet, but go out and actually look at it when the water's low. So this is where it's sitting. Okay, let me get back to my article here. So the new salvage guy was going to try and build a ramp and drag the ship onto the shoreline, and eventually that didn't work out. And let's just keep moving down here. So then comes into another guy, Bob Casilli. And Bob Casilli, if you're from St. Louis, you would know of him as an artist who created the St. Louis City Museum, and he had some very, very broad visions. So if you're not familiar with the St. Louis City Museum, it was created in a 10-story, 600,000 square foot former shoe factory warehouse in downtown St. Louis. And it's this just kind of odd collection of different things, like a school bus almost going off the edge. And the most famous thing there is there's like a, looks like a Learjet with maybe some sort of a chute or something that comes out of it. I've never been to it. But planetary dome, the really, really big shoe, bank vault door. So he would salvage a bunch of stuff and turn it into something else. Monstro City. Let's see if we can get this to open. Yeah. Look at some of the things here. Kind of a Ferris wheel looking thing. And these are just their photos. Big pipe organ. Just a very eclectic collection of different things. The rooftop, 10-story slide, world's largest pencil. So, and here's Bob. Bob dies in 2011, and we're going to come back to that. But he created the City Museum, and then he had this vision of creating another place that was called Cementland. Okay. So the gun goes missing. No one knows what happened to it. So what happens is that it ends up at Cementland. This guy who started the second salvage attempt at the USS Inaugural, basically, as I interpret this article, says that the gun is actually his because he has possession of the ship. And someone goes in there and breaks in the door and takes it, and it ends up at Cementland. So according to the Riverfront Times article, how did this guy come in possession of the gun? Quote, "I stole them. Captain Venable told me where I'd find them, and I know exactly where because I used to own that warehouse where they kept them. One night about 1 a.m., I got into one of my old trucks, drove down there, crashed through the gate, smashed it to hell, hooked up the gun on my rig and drove it off. If you knew the effing vultures in this business, you'd do the same. We get everything half-ass legal." So the gun is now at Cementland, and so this guy starts to try and salvage the ship, although it's really hard to get to because it's underwater quite a bit of the time. Okay, so now let's go to Cementland. So the last time the gun was seen was actually at Cementland, and that's where Bob Casilli was going to turn this former large cement plant into another theme park, kind of like what he did with the City Museum. So there's all these kind of crazy buildings and things like that. So if you're curious about Cementland, you should go to YouTube because there's a lot of different videos on there, people exploring it. Do not go to Cementland. It is a tetanus and broken leg situation just waiting to happen. But here you can kind of see some of these pictures. So his idea was to take a bunch of repurposed items and build bridges and walkways and things like that, and kind of turn it into a bit of a castle, and the whole thing is just kind of over the top. Oh, what just happened there? But what ends up happening is that in 2011, that Bob Casilli's working on Cementland, and there appears to be a bulldozer accident, a rollover accident, and he's found dead. So on September 26, 2011, Casilli was killed at the Cementland site, and it was initially reported that he died when a bulldozer he was driving flipped down a hill. However, in October 2016, a medical expert concluded that Casilli had been beaten to death and the bulldozer accident staged. So the family wanted to continue on with the project, but the whole site went into probate recently. Parts of it were put up for sale, and then part of it has been sold, and it's basically closed to the public. So let's get our bearings again here. I'll kind of show you where Cementland is located. So this is downtown St. Louis. Let's go upriver a little ways, and it's down in here. Let's see if I can find it. There's a park. Yeah, it's right in here. South of there's a green space that's right along in there. Here, let me just do this. Yeah, here we go. Cementland. There we go. Okay, so there's Cementland. Oh, I was in the ballpark. So this is Cementland. And this is the last place that the guns actually have been seen. And that was in 2007. So it's actually this area right in here. I believe this is a separate property. And then there's some riverfront property that were available as part of this. So I believe this section closest to the road was sold for $1.4 million, and I believe they're trying to sell the rest. So this is actually a big cement plant, and then this is some sort of a manufacturing facility. So after Bob Casilli dies, then the guns go missing. No one knows what happened to them. So the Inaugural is still sitting there. You can see in this picture here some of the salvage efforts that people have made. And again, the problem with salvaging the Inaugural is really just the state of the river, and getting to it is hard, and you can only do it maybe for a short period of time, and then the river comes up again. So in late 2012, Jim Fleshman and his crew of St. Louis salvagers began ripping apart the Minesweeper, hauling away more than 40 tons of the steel hull designed to withstand Japanese explosives. Again, this is the Riverfront Times article by Danny Wickenkowski from 25th of October 2021. So it's about 2 months old article. Talks a little bit about the history, but here's kind of what it looks like now. Again, the Minesweeper looks like it was hit by an explosion of rust, which colors the top of the ship in a deep red tinged ochre. Lower sections have become nearly white with their time beneath the surface. Parts of the hull show signs of salvage work. At some point after the ship sinking, the guns disappeared. There were no guns on it when when they did the salvage effort in 2012. One of them was up at Cementland. Now, Cementland actually had a big fire in 2016, which ruined quite a bit of stuff up there, and really stopped all the work on finishing the theme park that was there. And some of those exploration videos have the show some of the area that burned. Yeah, Casilli said himself the inaugural guns belonged to him on the Riverfront Times. All I know is possession is 9/10 of the law, and that gun is on my property. Now, the gentleman who was scrapping it believes that the anti-aircraft gun was donated to a museum, but no one seems to know which museum it was donated to. Venable died in 2006. Armed Forces Museum dissolved, and that collection went 100 directions. So no one really seems to know what happened to the gun that was up in Cementland. So, and I have three theories on it. Either it's still there, maybe buried somewhere in the site there, or damaged in the fire. My second theory is maybe it was sold off by the family, the people that actually owned it, or some of the people involved with the acquisition of it or the scrapping of the ship. The third theory is somebody went in there and just swiped it, and no one knows where it is. It's probably in someone's collection somewhere, or maybe someone actually just went there and scrapped it. That would be a fourth possibility. So, this has been the long and painful ending to the USS Inaugural. It's a crazy story, and I'm glad that you guys have stuck with it this long. The story of the Inaugural is not over. It's quite possible that the guns will reappear at some point, and they will continue to scrap it, or it will just plain fall apart in the river. So if you want to see one of these, you can go to that park in Omaha and check one out. Or if you're very, very motivated, you can go into the Mississippi River and go see the remnants. If there's a low water situation going on in the Mississippi, it's not far from the St. Louis Arch, maybe about a mile downstream. So anyway, that's the weird, wacky story of the USS Inaugural. And as I said, I promised gambling, murder, and some crazy theft situations going on there, and maybe some intrigue as well. So anyway, that is the story of the USS Inaugural. So if you happen to know anything, you can go ahead and add it in the comments. Again, I've tried to be very, very fair with the people involved with this story. There's a lot of accusations. If you really want to dig into this, read the Riverfront Times article, the one from 2007 and the one from 2021. You can get in all the different gory details. So anyway, hey, thanks for tuning in to the Peep Show, and I will catch you on the next one.